Welcome to the Textiles Taster session. My name's Teresa and I've been teaching at East Norfolk now for about 18 years. I've taught across a range of art subjects in the department and more recently I've been teaching on the Level 4 Art Foundation course, which is our pre-degree course. But as you can see from the setting that we're in, textiles is where my heart lies, and that's what I'm going to be talking to you about today. So the way the session is going to run is I'm going to show you a PowerPoint presentation, and included in that I've put some photographs of the classroom so you can get a sense for the space that you'll be working in. The pictures don't do it justification really. It's a beautiful space. It's a double height ceiling, you know, windows on all sides, so the light in there is really quite spectacular. And it's, you know, set up for specialist materials and processes, but I'll do my best and hopefully you'll get a feel for it in the photos. And I'm also going to show you some student work, so some of the work that the first years have been producing in this last academic year, and that should give you an idea of the kind of projects that we'll be going through. And then the last part of the session today, I'm going to get you going on a practical task, and it's based on one of the projects that you would be doing in the first year, so you're kind of getting a head start on it by having a little go today. It would be really helpful if you could have a notebook and a pencil just to take some notes, because this is something that you're going to go away and gather some materials for and spend a little bit of time making. And once you've got the process written down, it's something that you can do again and again, and it will have loads of different results, so it's really worth making some notes that you can refer back to. Okay, so the sessions today are pre-recorded. However, throughout the whole 45-minute session I am here and available to talk to you via chat, so any questions that you might have, whether that's a question arising throughout the PowerPoint, it might be about the course, you might have a question about you know, what you're currently doing at school, and you know, might have something that you want to ask, or you know, if anything comes up in the practical task that you're not sure about, just pop a question in the chat. That comes directly to me, it's not shared publicly with anybody else. I'll only share your question if it's really helpful to the rest of the group, and then I'll respond, and then everyone else can see the response. Okay, so let's get started with the PowerPoint presentation then. So this is the classroom, and as I said, the pictures don't do it complete justice, but you can just about kind of see the scale of the space. If you just look at the tables, and that they're design tables, so you know, made that you can work from them by standing. And this gives you an idea of how high those windows are and the scale of the overall space. In the second and third images, you can see that the ceiling is lower in those images. That's because half of the classroom has a mezzanine floor above it, and this houses our cutting table, digital fabric printer, which I'll touch on again later on, and also our fabric stores. So textiles is a very broad-based subject. I always find it really difficult to summarise it for things such as this, because there are so many different directions that you could take your work in depending on your own interest and the skills that you choose to develop on the course. Most projects will fall under an overall pathway such as fashion or costume, interior textiles, which would also include design for soft furnishings, wallpapers and so on. Some students will develop ideas within constructed textiles. This would include knitting, crochet, weaving and felt. Machine knitting has been of particular interest in the past year or so, and we now have 3 or 4 of those across the department, with some students in fine art also taking an interest in constructed textiles. Within the area of constructed textiles, you might also decide to then develop your project into a fashion context such as knitwear design. So there are some crossovers between the pathways. So the first year is divided into 2 parts. We begin the course with a period of 10 weeks where you are introduced to some of the materials and processes commonly used in textiles. You'll also develop research and analytical skills which you'll apply to your idea development, as well as those of contemporary and historical designers and practitioners. The second part of the year is called Personal Creative Inquiry. This is 100% coursework and is the only work submitted for your awarding of your AS grade. This is what I love most about the course and also the exam board that we're with, because it allows you time at the start of the course to experiment and play and find out what makes you excited about the course before moving on to formal coursework. There's no exam in the first year, and the second year has two components, one of which is coursework and along similar lines to the personal creative inquiry, and the second one is set externally, in which you then have 15 hours at the end of the component in which to make a resolved outcome. There is no theoretical exam in textiles, which may differ from your experiences at school. So over the next few slides, I've included some images from this last academic year, which will give you a little insight into the first term. This is our surface manipulation project, where we explore the properties of fabric and paper. We begin very simply with folding, pleating and tucks, and begin to consider how these can be applied to textile outcomes. As you can see from the photographs, this student applied her paper folding to ideas for garments. During this project, you'll be inducted into using the sewing machines. You do not need to have your own sewing machine at home. However, if you do have one, I can definitely help you in becoming more familiar with the functions, or alternatively, if you'd like to purchase a machine during the course, I'd be able to advise you on the best options within your budget. This is a little glimpse at our natural dye project. This is probably my favourite project at the moment. Your practical task today will explore the very basics of this, so I'll go into that in more detail later. But once you're at college, we'll have a really good play with this topic, and we'll explore how to create your own dyes from natural sources. We'll look at rust dyeing, as you can see in the centre image, and also a process called eco-printing or bundle dyeing. I'll also introduce you to mordants, which is a way of fixing your fabrics and also a way of adjusting your colour palette. So in the image on the left hand side, you can see it's labelled turmeric. So these 12 samples were created with one dye batch, but we've added different mordants to give us a broader palette range. So that's quite fun. Last year, Dual developed some work based on eco-printing or bundle dyeing in the spring summer collection, so that's really worth having a little look at if you're interested. Also in this project, which I don't have a photograph of here, we explore indigo dyeing and a method of creating intricate surface pattern called shibori, which is a broad Japanese term for stitching or folding your fabric to create pattern. In its simplest form, is better known as tie-dye. Our final project in the Skills Weeks is Surface Pattern. In this project, we look at creating our own fabric designs using Photoshop. You'll be introduced to this programme and learn how to create motifs and repeat patterns. You may recall I mentioned that we have a digital printer in the mezzanine of the classroom. As part of this project, you will each produce samples of your own fabrics, and these are printed and transferred onto a range of fabric options such as satin, chiffon, cotton and so on. And on this course, we try to avoid using commercially bought fabrics, preferring to print, dye or construct our own. There are also options in this project, or even at a later date, to explore alternative hand printing methods such as heat sublimation, lino printing and screen printing. These are the assessment objectives, not only for the textiles course in both years, but also across all of the Art A levels on offer. You'll see there are 4 key areas, and each are weighted equally. You have develop ideas, use of materials and processes, recording observations, and presenting meaningful outcomes. Each of the AOs are equally weighted. They also include commentary, evaluation and reflection. So developing an understanding of critical thinking and use of appropriate vocabulary is key, and we'll work together on this in your first year. There aren't any subjects you shouldn't study alongside textiles. We've had all sorts of combinations over the years. It's really common to study 2 Art A levels, and I'd recommend taking the time to explore the other subjects available within the department, especially if you already know you'd like to explore a career in the creative industries. A second art A-level would really strengthen your portfolio for either job interviews or those at higher education. You can see here I made a few notes as well about some of the other subjects that have been quite beneficial. So students who've done performing arts courses will sometimes develop along ideas for costume or stage work. And this year a student took a particular interest in the suffragette movement, and so her courses in history were really beneficial for her for that. Having completed Skills Week, we move on to the personal creative inquiry. The key word here is personal. For this project, we would work together to develop an investigation based on your skills and interests. So at this point, you could be making very different work to the other students in the class. Teaching becomes more individualised, and you'll take part in workshops during class time to build skills appropriate to your ideas. At this stage, I should mention we have a fantastic team of art technicians who you will get to know well, and on occasion you may work one-to-one with them on a particular process. The knitting machines, for example, where the setup can take some time, or perhaps you might need access to the laser cutter, and then you'd go down into the 3D workshop. So in this slide is a little snapshot of some work produced this year under a fashion context. So you can see here, idea development, drawing, samples, and then a couple of examples of final outcomes. It's quite a nice progression here. And this is some fine art textiles. You can see here that we've got work that could be considered as conceptual, such as the piece on the far right. So sometimes in textiles it's not always about functional work. You can do something for beauty, you could do something that you feel fired up about and you've got something to say. So sometimes that kind of falls under the fine art context. And there are different approaches to that. And previously students have made landscape paintings using textiles such as embroidery and applique. There's so many different things that you can do under this pathway. Interior textiles often has surface pattern design included, as you can see from the examples here. The piece on the left is a room divider, and the student has used both digital textiles and hand smocking for this outcome. So these are two processes that she was introduced to in the Skills Weeks. On the right, we have work which is more easily recognised as an interior project, and we can see the student has worked with hand-painted imagery to develop her patterns. And I've currently got a student who is exploring rug design in this pathway, so it really is a broad subject to work with. This is a little peek at some of the places our students head to after A-levels. It's never too early to begin to consider progression. There are a couple of excellent degrees locally at Norwich University of the Arts. We've got textile design and fashion design, and they also offer a fashion promotion course if you prefer to go down that route. There's also the option to stay on at East Norfolk and complete our Level 4 Art Foundation course, which is the equivalent of a first year degree, and we will talk to you more about that when you're on the course. As textiles is such a broad subject, the option for careers are also very broad. For example, within fashion, you could specialise in menswear, children's wear, sportswear, underwear, and so on. You might also prefer to develop fabric for fashion, so you do the design for the print rather than the actual construction of the garments themselves. Or you might prefer to go into tailoring, using bought fabrics to create fitted garments. So that pathway itself has a multitude of options. As a surface pattern designer, you could create prints for commercial use, such as on wrapping paper, or designs for a company like the Chilly water bottles, or stationery for a company such as Paper Chase, as well as obviously exploring print for fashion or interior use. So on to our frequently asked questions then. Do you have to be good at drawing to take textiles? Not at all. A key element of textile design is exploring what drawing might mean in this context and finding an approach that suits you. So we can look at experimental drawing, for example, using textile techniques such as embroidery. That's a really lovely way of drawing, or making marks using stitch. and the free machine embroidery option on their sewing machines. All of that is covered on the course. You don't need to make a really beautiful observation of a mushroom, let's say, to be able to develop strong ideas. But drawing does play a part. But I like to think that we explore it in a very creative way. What materials will I need to buy for the course? So I will go through, when you start the course, a list of basic materials that would be beneficial. I have made up textile packs, which would be available to purchase from the college shop on site, and that does include some basic things such as fabric scissors, an embroidery hoop, needles, threads, and also very fine scissors, which can be really helpful, particularly if you develop an interest in something like embroidery, or just for neating up things like your seams. I've mentioned already that you don't need a sewing machine. Do I need to have previous experience in textiles to take the course? It is preferable for you to come through from school with either a grade C in art and design or textiles, but as all of the processes are taught from scratch during the first term, it is suitable for beginners. Students with more knowledge at the start of term will be assigned extension tasks to stretch learning. So, for example, if you come from a textiles background and you're already very confident with the sewing machines, you would be on a slightly different series of exercises to, say, a student had come from a fine art background and didn't have experience working with a machine. Students that don't have any of the necessary qualifications will be asked to provide a portfolio of work at the start of the academic year. I know you might have some questions about that, and it really isn't a very onerous task. It's just an opportunity for us to have a chat with you and to look at the things that you're interested in, so that we can see that you would benefit from taking the course. And final question, which I get asked all the time, and I think which is really sad that I get asked it, but is this course just for girls? It is not a course for girls. Many successful designers and makers are men, and they all start in this place. So the course is not a course for girls. Here's some links to our social media. Instagram is particularly useful because it has quite a lot of the work that we've been producing in the last year or so. So I'd really recommend checking that out. And then finally here we have our contact details, just a reminder of those. So if you do need to get in touch, or if you feel perhaps you've got a question after this session and you haven't asked it during the live chat option, then do get in touch with us and see what we can do. Okay, so we'll move on to the practical task now. Welcome to the practical session. For this task, I'm going to teach you a really simple method of creating dye using basic kitchen equipment and food materials which are easily sourced. I would recommend taking notes during the PowerPoint, and if you're viewing this tutorial on a mobile phone, you could always take some screenshots. This will just act as a reminder of how you go about using this process, because it might be something that you would like to return to, or you may not be in a position to start the task straight away. So we'll start by having a look at what I have at home and what you may have at home in your kitchens, which would be suitable for creating dyes. I just had a look at what I had to hand. So you can see in the picture here, I've got tea, coffee, some spices, some berries, and food. Turmeric, you'll see there, that's the yellow powder. For anyone who's ever spilt curry down a t-shirt and had a permanent stain on it, that's where the colour comes from. So this is a really reliable method of creating colour, and I'd recommend using the turmeric dye if you've got a chance to experiment with it. I haven't included saffron on here. You may find that in your cupboard, and I would definitely ask permission before using it, because it's incredibly expensive, but it does also give out a really nice colour. Some of the other things, if I talk you through the image, you'll see there's an avocado. Now, avocado, you might guess that the colour would turn green, but it does actually create a really soft pink, slightly beigey tone. We only use the avocado skins, and you might need to eat a few of them to be able to get up enough of the matter to be able to create a colour. The red cabbage you can see in the background, that's a really fantastic dye, and you'll see as it pops into the water so that you get this lovely colour, kind of bluey purple tone coming off it straight away. Teas can be quite successful, but you do need several tea bags to get a strong colour. The materials that we're going to be using today are onion skins and blueberries. If you don't have either of those at home, you could maybe have a little search on Google and see what alternatives are available to you. You will notice that in the picture where I've got the fruit, you'll see a green leaf. Now I've included this because if you do a little bit of extra research, you will find that some of the websites will suggest plant materials for dyeing, and they are fantastic. The only thing I would say is please don't use your household pans for that process. You'll need a separate dye pan that you would only ever use for dyeing. You don't want to mix plant material with pots that you use for food. However, today's exercise where we're using berries and food items are perfectly safe to use in your normal kitchen. The leaf I've included in this picture is from my blackberry bush in the garden, and I've included it because it is a fantastic source of colour. Again, it isn't green, but it actually comes out of the colour of the fruits itself. We often use blackberry leaves in our eco dyeing or bundle dyeing, which I mentioned on the previous PowerPoint. So they're really great. If you've got brambles in your local hedgerows when you're out walking, they're a really good thing to collect. But again, like I said, do not use any plant material in your home saucepans. Okay, let's move on. So in this image here, you can see some of the basic equipment that you'll need to complete this task. I've got a couple of saucepans, a knife which can be helpful depending on which material that you're using to make your dye from, scissors, and then you'll see also I've got some fabrics and some yarns. When selecting fabrics to dye with, you can either use scrap material if you have any kind of pale material, even if it's got a little bit of pattern or print on it, you could have it go over dyeing that. Or you could, use a piece of old clothing or an old tea towel and see what happens to the colour in that. So have a little hunt around and see what you've got available. If you're using natural dyes, they work best with animal fibres. So that would be things such as wool, silk, are really great materials that you could work with, or even alpaca, which gets used to make yarn. So I'd recommend having a go at those. They can sometimes be a little bit harder to source. The next sort of step down, if you like, in terms of reliability are your plant-based materials, things such as cotton, hemp and linen. So today I'm going to be showing you what happens when we use a wool that's made from sheep, and then some yarn that is synthetic, so show what happens when you react with polyester, and then also a cotton-based yarn. You'll see sometimes that the dye will take to the material differently. So here are my pans then. I'm using onion skins in the left-hand pan. Now normally I would not mix the white or brown onions with the red onions. I'd make separate dye baths for them, but just for the purpose of today I thought, well, I'll just bung them all in together. What you'll see here is with anything like a skin, you need to cut it up into small pieces. So that would be the same if you were using avocado skins or anything else like that, or peelings. You could try making a dye from something like carrot peelings. So make sure that before you put them in your pan that you chop them up. Scissors often work quite well for that, and I know when I've done natural dyes with my own small children, we always use scissors. In the pot on the right hand side, you'll see some blueberries. Now, I don't know what happens in your household, but I tend to buy fruit and then within a couple of days some of it's gone a bit soft, and you can see just to the left of the saucepan some of the blueberries had gone mouldy, which is why I decided to use those in the dye bath. It's okay to use fruit that's past best, and I think that's a really great way of using up things that would otherwise be heading for the bin or your compost. What I would recommend with anything like a berry is to give it a bit of a mash before you start to try to make it into dye. Otherwise you're almost just kind of boiling the fruit, and really we want to release all of the colours from the dye matter. Okay, so then we put our pans on to boil. Now you only want to put in enough boiling water to cover the material that you're using. The reason we do that is because we don't want to weaken the colour. You can always add extra water if you need a slightly larger dye bath at the end of it, but we don't want to dilute the colour for this experiment. You want to simmer your dye material for about 20 minutes. Don't leave your pan unattended. You need to make sure that the pan doesn't dry out and that your dye matter doesn't stick to the bottom of the pan. So I would suggest using a metal spoon and just giving it an occasional stir. When I did this experiment in preparation for this task, I found that the blueberries, started to turn almost to like a slightly jam consistency. So I did top it up with a little bit of water partway through the simmering process. So you really must keep an eye on your pan. Okay, after it's simmered for about 20 minutes, you need to strain your dye material. Make sure you use a metal colander or a sieve because some of the dye materials will stain your equipment. Something like turmeric, if you're just using the powder, you shouldn't need to strain it, but you may find that you have a sort of powdery residue at the bottom of your dye bath. So when you're straining it, I'd recommend adding a small amount of the kind of solids to your sieve at a time, and then using the back of the spoon to just press through and squeeze out as much colour. Now, depending on which dye material you're using, that will be simpler or more complex depending on what you've got. So something like your red cabbage, for example, the dye just kind of runs off the cabbage and you bin the waste, whereas something like a berry such as a raspberry or the blueberries, you really do need to give them a good squish. I should have mentioned earlier as well that frozen fruit works really well, so that's quite a nice thing that you could try as well. So those mixed berry bags that you can get from the supermarket, they produce a pretty good colour. Okay, so here's where we start to experiment with actually dyeing the fabric. In this piece of fabric here, I've just cut a very small square of white cotton, and then you can see in the image here, I've just loosely bound it. I pinched the fabric up with my fingers and then wrapped some ordinary thread around it to hold in place. If you don't have thread, you could use elastic bands or an old hair bobble if you had one of those. You could use paper clips, or even you could just try knotting it. That can work really well. So, if you don't have any extras like that, then, there are ways around it. Instead of doing pinches, you could put marbles into the fabric and trap those with a little bit of thread, or you could try folding or pleating the fabric. So here's an opportunity where you can really experiment with what kind of marks that you can make. And I mentioned in the previous PowerPoint that part of the indigo dyeing section would be looking into these kind of techniques in more detail. And one of the things that we spend quite a bit of time on is actually quite complex stitching into the fabric, which creates a really nice resist. So we'll be developing that further on the course when you start there. And one more thing to add before you dye your fabric: it's best if you wet it before you put it into the dye. That kind of opens up the fibres and will allow the dye to kind of penetrate the surface of the fabric better. Alright, so here's my dye baths. On the left you can see I've got the blueberries, and I've put some different yarns into the pots. I've put my woolen yarn, which I mentioned, I've got a polyester yarn in there, and also a cotton one. So here we have animal fibres, plant fibres and synthetic fibres in there. And in each of the two dye baths I've also got a small fabric sample which I've bound in different ways. The blueberry one has been bound just by kind of scrunching it and then putting some threads around it, whereas obviously we've already talked about the onion one where I've pinched it and bound it. You'll also see that I put a small amount of dye on the paper underneath it, and you'll see that the colour has changed quite significantly between the colour on the paper and the colour in the dye bath, and that is because as the dye touched the white paper, it reacted with the bleach that is found in papers. So things like your toilet roll and sketchbook paper and stuff is often bleached to get a stronger white colour. So just a word of caution: when you want to dry your samples, don't dry them onto paper. Because I was at home, I used a plate, but you know, if we were at college we might use a sheet of plastic. You could put cling film down. There's lots of different options, but just bear in mind, if you do use paper, it will have some kind of extra reaction. So you leave your samples to soak. Really, you need at least 10 minutes. I think I left these for about an hour in the end, and it's worth giving them a good chance to soak. I also occasionally turned them just to make sure that the surface was equally coated. Okay, so this is when I first brought out my samples from the dye bath. On the left hand side we've got the onion skins, and you can see the 4 yarns that I put in actually dyed relatively evenly. Even the polyester one, which is second from bottom, took quite a lot of the onion colour on, and the combination between the brown and red onion skins has really given it this really nice, rich, sort of deep red colour. The blueberries have come out quite purple in tone, with sort of red tones to them as well. You can see here the yarns have actually taken the dye quite differently, and the polyester dye, which I would have expected to have not taken on quite so much colour, is very, very pale. And bear in mind as well, at this point these samples are wet, so they all dried a little bit paler overall. But it's quite nice to see the different colours that we achieved by using different materials. So these are my samples. I left them to dry overnight. That just gave the dye a bit more time to soak in and set. And that's something I definitely recommend with your own samples. It's always tempting when you've dyed something to unravel it straight away, but with natural dyeing you really want to give it time to dry, which is part of the reason why we can't complete this whole task during this session today, but makes it really exciting for the next day when you get them out. You can see here that the thread that I used to bind the samples has not been touched by the dye. That's because I used a polyester thread, which most sewing machine thread is polyester based. So you can see here it didn't alter the colour at all. That was quite useful for me because it meant I could clearly see the threads and was able to unravel them with no real issue. Okay, and here's our samples unravelled. Now, interestingly, and I don't know why this is, I used the same fabric for all 4 of these samples. The top samples were not bound at all. They were just left in the dye bath and sat flatly throughout the whole time. In the onion skins on the right hand side, there's not that much difference in tone between the flat sample and the textured one, whereas in the blueberries I seem to have got a very pale purple overall, but a sort of richer pinker tone in the sample that I bound. That's one of the really interesting things about natural dye, is you're not always sure what you're going to get, and I was quite surprised by that difference. Okay, so a day forward, here's some dried samples. You can see they've all faded slightly as they've kind of settled into their colour. That's partly because I left them out on the work surface for a day and before taking this photograph, because it's quite interesting to see that actually, although you get these really exciting colours sometimes and you can create patterns, natural dyes can sometimes be a bit sensitive to light. So it's worth trying to keep them protected, keep them in a folder, or keep them in a dark place. To preserve the colour fastness of your fabric, it's worth storing them in somewhere like an airing cupboard for maybe about a week before you then start to use them. They will still fade over time, but just giving them a little bit longer to settle down does prolong the life a little bit. And here are our samples all together. So it's quite nice to be able to see a close-up of the fibres that we dyed. You can see a bit more clearly now that they've all dried, how the colour has sat with the yarn. You can see with the blueberries, they still had a bit of the blueberry flesh attached to them. So I really need to go back and wash them. And certainly if I was thinking about dyeing a larger batch to then perhaps knit with or weave with, I'd really need to get off the kind of bits so that they didn't kind of stick to the fibres. So that's worth doing if you're interested in dyeing yarn for that purpose. So what I'd really like you to do now is to go away and have a play with things. What can you create at home? What have you got access to? You might want to save up some onion skins for a few weeks and then have a go at that. You might have something in your fridge that is, on its way, and you want to give that a go now. If you do have a go, please do tag East Norfolk Arts on Instagram with the experiments, because I'd really love to see what you're creating. And if you have any technical problems, it's a really good way of contacting me on that. And also hang on to any samples that you make. You will be able to hand them in as part of the Natural Dye project, and it will put you in a really good starting point for that unit. If this has excited you and you'd like to learn a little bit more about it, there's a few things that I would recommend. Babs Bean, she's the author of a book called Botanical Inks, and she also has an Instagram page of the same name. She's brilliant. She is so open and sharing with her processes that if you did want to look at different ways of dyeing your material, then she would be a really good starting point. I recently completed one of her online courses during lockdown, and it was just absolutely brilliant. And occasionally she will do courses which she calls pay as you feel. So as a student, you perhaps wouldn't have a lot of funds to maybe contribute towards it, and you could perhaps pay as little as £5 to do this workshop, with a contemporary artist. So it's a great opportunity. Another artist I'd really recommend is India Flint. She's best known for eco printing. Fascinating woman, does a lot of work with eucalyptus leaves, which is worth looking at. And then Dior Spring Summer collection of 2019. They produced the most delicate of prints onto their garments last year, and using things like the tops of carrots and some of the more delicate kind of spring flowers. Really interesting body of work, which you might find inspiring. I look forward to seeing what you achieve. Have fun and keep playing. And I look forward to seeing you in September.